Before we start our episode, let's chat about Jane. Many of you are familiar with the name, but if you're new to it, Jane app is a clinic management software and our show sponsor. The Jane team knows that no-shows and late cancellation pose a real challenge for clinics, and they want to help. One way they do that is by making it easy for you to create effective policies that can be enabled and communicated to your patients. The first policy is an online booking payment policy. When integrated with Jane Payments, you have the option to request a card on file or deposit at the time of booking. You can also enable credit card collection directly in your intake forms for an extra layer of no-show prevention. The next policy is a cancellation policy, which you can request your patients acknowledge and consent to in an intake form. Jane will also reiterate your cancellation policy in future appointment-related emails sent to your patients so you won't have to remind them. If you want to see these features in action, you can book a personalized demo at jane.app/payments. If you're ready to sign up for your Jane account, don't forget to mention my 1-month grace period code, CardioPalm1MO. Thanks again, Jane. Hello, and welcome to another episode of Talking All Things CardioPalm. I'm your host, Dr. Rachel Barisi. So we're going to jump right into today's episode because I have officially spent too much time diving into a rabbit hole on this topic. So I'll give you a little background as to what I'm talking about today and kind of why I decided to talk about it on the podcast. I was asked a question late last week about the RPE scale. And the question was very simple. It related to exactly how do you ask the patient, the client, to rate themselves on the RPE scale. It's a great question because a lot of scales have specific instruction or specific verbiage that should be used. So first of all, RPE stands for rate of perceived exertion. And when we're talking about the RPE scale, we're talking about the Borg RPE scale, or at least we should be, right? That's where it has developed from. And that's kind of what we're going to dive into a little bit today, because I have learned a lot about Borg, his RPE scales, and maybe what we didn't realize or what I didn't realize, or kind of putting some of the pieces together. So I wanted to kind of bring this to you. So when we're using the RPE scale, typically the way I have been taught is to utilize it for basically perceived exertion with aerobic activity or some sort of workload. And the beautiful thing about the RPE scale is that it has high correlation to heart rate. So all wonderful things. I used RPE scale in cardiac rehab, taught it to our patients. We typically use a 6 to 20 scale. It is my preferred scale. And the reason is the 6 to 20 scale has some history behind it. And so the history that I knew was that it correlates specifically to heart rate. So if you were to add a 0 onto 6 to 20, you now have 60 to 200, which correlates very nicely to resting at 60 and then 200 being max, right? So now we can put not only numbers and words, but we can attach it to a heart rate. And so this is a wonderful thing in cardiac rehab because most of the time we're actually keeping patients within a target heart rate if they're not on a beta blocker. And we teach patients how to monitor their heart rate when they basically discharge or graduate from cardiac rehab so they can continue that on their own. But we also teach them RPE because RPE is a great way for patients to self-rate their exertion. And since it has such great correlation to heart rate, it's easier for patients to essentially utilize RPE to gauge their exercise intensity without, monitors and all that stuff. Or just like a quick check-in. So I prefer the 6 to 20 scale, always have, still do after the amount of research I have read, but it is considered the original RPE scale or original Borg scale. What is interesting is that there are specific instructions attached to it that I have never heard. And so I'm going to kind of share with you what I used to do and now what I have learned today that I'm going to share with you. So typically when I was teaching the RPE scale and what I teach my students and what I've taught my past residents is that you show the scale to the patient, which has the numbers and words attached to it, and basically describe what the scale is. This is an RPE scale. It rates your level of perceived exertion, how hard you feel like you're working with exercise. from 6 to 20, 6 being resting, no work at all, or no exertion at all, and 20 being maximum effort, max effort that you've ever experienced. Where on this scale at this very moment do you feel like your rate of perceived exertion is? Use the words to help guide you. That was kind of my verbiage. And what is important about that is that not only was I showing a 6 to 20 scale, but I was cueing the patient to utilize the words to assess how they feel, right? It's a perception, it's a subjective feeling. And most patients did really well with it. Now, what I have heard in this most recent episode with this question being asked, and just in general, is that patients have a really hard time with the 6 to 20 scale because it's not a normal scale that they would see. And they would prefer a 0 to 10 scale. So most people now use the Borg 0 to 10 scale, which is actually called the CR10 scale. Now, I guess the conversation around that is that patients are more comfortable with a 0 to 10 scale, therefore they use it more accurately. I think scales are scales in the sense that some patients have a hard time of rating how they rate themselves on any scale, whether it's a pain scale, a dyspnea scale, an RPE scale, like whatever you're using, an angina scale. I think some patients have a harder time with scales, and you get a lot of patients that overestimate and you get a lot of patients that underestimate. And you can kind of get a good feel of this, right off the bat. I remember having a patient in cardiac rehab on treadmill, on an incline. We were increasing him. He was in like just at the top of his target heart rate. And I remember asking him, how hard does it feel like you're working based on the scale? Because we have done it a whole bunch of times. And he always would say 6. He would just say 6. And so he was a hard one to like really get him to utilize it correctly. And by the end of cardiac rehab, he did well with it. But there are some people who just underestimate. And then there's the other side of the spectrum where people overestimate. I think regardless of what numbers are on that scale, you're going to have this issue. I like 6 to 20 because it has this nice correlation to heart rate, which is great, especially in phase 1 or phase 2 cardiac rehab. Because in phase 1 cardiac rehab in the acute care setting, you want to typically keep patients at a heart rate under 120. RPE goal somewhere around 9 to 11. So that gives you a nice little range from a number perspective and an RPE perspective to have eyes on the patient and also to teach the patient to gauge how they feel. In my opinion, I think it's a superior scale. But a lot of people like the 0 to 10. 0 to 10 has caught on with its use and is approved and recommended by ATS for 6-minute walk test use and other use, as well as ACSM. The one thing that kind of tripped me up, which actually led me to this rabbit hole, was I looked at the scales that were being asked, how I would rate it. And it wasn't even about the question at this point. I saw the scale, and the words on the scale, the 0 to 10 scale, did not seem correct to me. They had a lot of words like severe, severe, very severe, somewhere around like the 4, 5, 6 range. And I was like, this doesn't look right. It should be closer to the 6 to 20 scale, although the words are not exactly the same with the 6 to 20 scale to the 0 to 10. They're closer than what I was seeing. So essentially I was like, well, let me go check what I have and see what my underlying reference is, because I always like to check where my references have come from. And, you use things over years and maybe you just don't pay attention to what the original source was. So I checked ACSM first because that's just a quick, I know it's in there. And it had a reference for Borg. And so I kind of went down the Borg rabbit hole and learned a ton of information right off the bat. So we'll kind of talk about that in a second. But the other piece of that is the 0 to 10 scale. And so the 0 to 10 scale, again, very well researched, has good correlation to heart rate, not as good as a 6 to 20 scale. And what I didn't know was that the Borg CR10 scale can be used for things other than rate of perceived exertion. Now, I have always used the RPE 6 to 20 scale as my exertion scale. And on dyspnea, I use what was called the modified Borg dyspnea scale, which is a 0 to 10 scale, and then has verbiage attached to it. And I've always used this. Learned it in my residency, use it in pulmonary rehab, all the things. So 0 to 10 scale has words attached to it. Things like nothing at all, very, very slight, slight, moderate, somewhat severe, severe, very severe, and then it gets to maximal. And I always use that scale. And on that scale, 4 out of 10 is like your stop component on exercise. What I learned today is there are a ton of erroneous modified, and I'm air quoting this, modified Borg scales. And so the actual 0 to 10 CR10 scale that Borg has created can also be used for dyspnea. Just like rocked my world. So I would normally use the 6 to 20 for RPE, and I would use the 0 to 10 for dyspnea, but the words attached to that modified Borg scale is not actually Borg's original work. So learned a ton of stuff today. So we'll kind of get into that a little bit. So Dr. Borg started his research in the early 60s, and he had a scale before the 6 to 20 scale, which was actually a 1 to 21 scale. And it had really good correlation, something like 0.91 in regards to heart rate correlation with the scale. But it had a problem with linear movement. It didn't move linearly with heart rate. So he adapted it. He did research quite a bit. There's quite a bit of articles kind of talking about how they started adjusting the numbers. But the gist of it is that at a RPE of 17 on the 1 to 21 scale, the heart rate was 170. And that seemed to be like an accurate correlation. And when you're doing things like submax exercise stress tests, typically you have a stop number, like 80% of max heart rate or 85% of max heart rate is a stopper if it's not a symptom limited test. And so 170 tend to be on that stopping point. And so they started adjusting it, and they realized that heart rate really had a great correlation. So then they looked at, well, resting heart rate is 60. How about we start at 60? And it sort of just kind of adjusted from there. And the 6 to 20 scale has been around, I think, since the either late 60s or early 70s. Ton of research on it, ton of correlation on heart rate, VO2 max, and just exercise intensity and its linear movement width when you kind of plot it out on a graph. So that kind of speaks the same as to the things that we knew, but there is some verbiage behind how you should introduce the scale. And on the actual Borg RPE scale, the 6 to 20 scale, it's not just 6 to 20 with like no exertion, extremely light, very light, that kind of stuff. There's also little descriptors next to it as well. So I'm going to kind of give a little overview of what the instructions should be. Essentially, they say that you want to introduce the scale, tell it what its purpose is, get a subjective feeling of what they have experienced in their past, and then help them correlate it to the words on the page. And it's really important to make a point about utilizing the words on the page and then picking the number associated with it. I think in the 50s, there was some research basically saying that this type of scale would never make it. And I think it was a really big point to show how well it actually works. So the actual instructions read, use the scale to tell how strenuous and tiring the work feels to you. The exertion is mainly felt as fatigue in your muscles and as breathlessness or possible aches. When the exercise is hard, it also becomes difficult to talk. It's your own feeling of exertion that's important. Don't underestimate it, but don't overestimate it either. For common exercises such as cycling, running, or walking, 11 to 15 is a good level. For the strength and high intensity interval training like HIITs, 15 to 19 is good. If you are sick, follow your doctor's advice. Look at the scale and the descriptions and then choose a number. Use whatever number you want, even numbers between the descriptions. Essentially, you could add half points. So from what I'm reading, you don't have to read it verbatim, kind of like the 6-minute walk test, but you do have to introduce it and make sure that you're understanding, or they're understanding, what the descriptor is that they're rating. So the 6 to 20 scale is always perceived exertion. And typically you should say that it's based on how hard it feels, or the level of fatigue, or how hard their muscles are working, that kind of thing. They do talk about breathlessness, but I think sometimes breathlessness can be difficult, but they do differentiate it from dyspnea. So as you work out, you're going to become more breathless and potentially might not be able to speak like in a full sentence. It's not saying the patient is dysmic or client is dysmic. So I thought the verbiage was interesting. I like that it gives some descriptors, like, so 6 is no exertion at all, and its descriptor is no muscle fatigue, breathlessness, or difficulty in breathing. 7 is extremely light, very, very light. 9, very light, like walking slowly for a short while, very easy to talk. Somewhat hard, fairly strenuous and breathless, not easy to talk. Hard, heavy, and strenuous, and an upper limit for fitness training as when running or walking fast. And then 20, maximal exertion, maximal heaviness. So they give some added descriptors to sort of guide the person. Why he switched or started creating the 0 to 10, I was reading about, and I can't remember the nuance behind it, but essentially they were trying to figure out if they could use it for other purposes, like pain or dyspnea, or even chest pain is written in there. And some of the verbiage around that isn't really my favorite, to be honest, but it is included. And I believe that happened in the 80s. So somewhere in the 80s, they created the Borg CR10 scale. And that's rated from 0 to 10, nothing at all. And then it goes extremely weak, weak, strong, very strong, extremely strong, absolute maximum. Now, what is interesting on the 0 to 10 scale is that there is this added like bullet mark at the end. And essentially, it gives room for the person subjectively to say even higher than that. And the nuance behind some of the like added ability to extend that scale is basically saying, I could imagine it being even harder or worse or what have you. So I thought that was interesting. I have never noticed the bullet mark on the 0 to 10 scale, but it is in the ACSM scale. It's there. Never noticed it. How many years I've been doing this, talking about this, teaching it, I have never noticed that added absolute maximum, for example, 12 or even somewhat more. So it gives room to go beyond 0 to 10. Now, what is interesting is that the 0 to 10 scale has good correlation to heart rate. They basically adjusted it quite a few times to make it fit. Its con is that it does not move linearly with exercise intensity. So it doesn't move as nicely as a 6 to 20 scale, but seems to have really good correlation. I think it was like 0.8 to 0.9 or something like that. What is even more interesting to me is that 0 to 10 scale is meant to be utilized for multiple things. Anything that the person can subjectively define. So if you needed someone to like subjectively state how loud something was, how sour something is, how painful it is. There's a lot of talk about use of this CR10 for pain as well, and has correlation with the visual analog scale, but the VAS scale is still gold standard based on international pain committees and such. So interesting to kind of see that the 0 to 10 translation actually can be utilized for other things. And I have a list here of all the things that it can be used for. Breathlessness was one of our, dyspnea was the other one. Dyspnea, pain, angina. Angina is on that list. And I haven't gotten to the point where they really talk about angina, although it's in the instructions that if they have like achy feeling in their chest, I don't know. That's the one part of the 0 to 10 that I'm not in love with, especially in the instruction category. Not that angina can't be rated on a 0 to 10 scale, but that it's sort of additive in some of the verbiage. It's not like its own thing. Like, this is the angina scale. It's a 1 to 4 scale. Once you have it, like we're quitting exercise. So I feel like it almost makes it a little wishy-washy in some ways, that it has so much ability to correlate to different things. So the instructions are, using this rating scale, report how strong your perception is. And then that gives you freedom to kind of insert what they're perceiving, whether it's like how bright it is in this room, how loud it is in the room, how much pain they feel, exertion, right? You can still use it for exertion, how dysmic you feel. First look at the words on the scale, and I really like this verbiage. First look at the words on the scale and then the numbers. Of these 10 or extremely strong maximals, very important intensity level. This is the most intense perception or feeling that you've ever had. Meaning, if you were using the 0 to 10 scale for pain, you would say, what is the most pain you've ever been in? That's your 10. And so it gives them the perception of something they have already felt, and then allows them to adjust from there. Now use the words to help describe how you feel. Now, I don't know if I said it clearly before, but this is the same scale you use for dyspnea. That one blew me away because I've always used the modified Borg RPE scale, as we called it, 0 to 10 scale with verbiage on the side, but the words are different. They're different. So the dyspnea scale that I used was very, very slight, moderate, somewhat severe, and then it works its way to maximal. Whereas the standard 0 to 10 scale actually has 2 columns of words, which I do like, and there's some similarity in the verbiage, but it's just a little different. So in the left column, you have nothing at all, extremely weak, very weak, moderate, strong, very strong, extremely strong. And then in the right column, which is also associated with the same number levels, it's just noticeable, light, heavy, maximal. So some of the conversation that I'm reading is that the erroneous scales use the word severe, and they really don't like the term severe because it has its own perception attached to it. So essentially, you want to keep it standardized. You want to use the same words for whatever perceptual thing you're trying to rate, and that you're introducing the scale. You're sort of getting a baseline of their like overall perceived feeling on that matter, and then they're rating from there. So I thought that was really interesting. I'm not going to go into it, but there's also a 0 to 100 scale. Now, I knew there was a bigger scale. I didn't know it was a Borg scale. This one seems to have been created, I think it was in the 90s, and this was a collaboration between Dr. Borg and his daughter, Dr. Borg. So it's Borg, and I think it's like 1982, something like that. And essentially, they use the 0 to 100 scale to get a little bit more nuanced with the rating, because the 0 to 10 kind of takes away some of the nuance, and like you only have so much room on the scale. So I did not dive into the 0 to 100 scale yet, but the verbiage is also very similar. There's similar instructions. They really encourage you to introduce the scales properly, and then make sure that the patient or client understands the use of the scale related to their perception. And I think that's really important. So I didn't have an outline for this, and I have literally been reading about Borg and his scales probably almost for 4 hours. So I'm kind of like, you're real time hearing my brain sort of synthesize this information. So apologies if this is a little bit all over the place, but I was 100% surprised that, well, I wasn't surprised that there's like erroneous versions and people have like adapted it and just call it the Borg scale. But there's also some nuance into not utilizing colors. Like a lot of times you see an RPE scale and has like color coded like green, yellow, red. They actually advise against that. You want to keep it in the order that it exists. I've seen the scales flipped where like the 10 is at the top and the 0 is at the bottom. That is not the case on the 6 to 20 or the 0 to 10 scale. And then for whatever reason, that added little bullet kind of threw me because I have never noticed it. I have never taught it. I have never been taught it. And so here's to say just like a thing about learning. You will never stop learning if you allow yourself to. I think, sometimes you do things so automatic. I literally have been teaching the RPE scale since I did my residency. And so we're talking how many years now? Since 2015. So almost 10 years. Probably actually before, because you include my residency, 11 years if you include the residency, right? I've been doing this, talking about this stuff for 11 years. And I literally have learned 20 new things today. There's also a book. There's a 1998 book that Borg wrote, basically describing the scales, the development of the scales, the translation of the scales, the morphing of the scales. Like there was this original 1 to 21 that morphed into the 6 to 20. And then he started creating a 0 to 10 scale. And then he collaborated with someone in the US to basically make that scale a thing. And now there's a 0 to 100 scale. And just very interesting to see the breakdown, analyze the research. There's so much research, so many different studies performed utilizing these scales from him and alternate people. One thing, if I haven't said it yet, the RPE scale is trademarked. And so if you are going to use it in either education, like I'm doing today, or if you're, part of a hospital setting and you're trying to utilize the RPE scale, it should be licensed. So I actually received license to talk about this. There is a cost attached to it, especially if you're doing it at like a hospital level. But I think it's important, and I think it's really important to utilize scales and devices as they're meant to be. And not everything is meant to, be extrapolated upon and modified and whatever, because the reason why these scales work the way they work is because they have been researched and standardized to do so. And as you start, for instance, changing the verbiage on the scale, you change the scale. You change the reliability, the validity, all of that. So don't be afraid to dig into something that you have literally been using for years, and don't be afraid to make the correction. I certainly am. So 6 to 20 scale, pretty much the same as you've probably have always seen. 0 to 10 scale starts at 0, and then it works its way incrementally. So it's 0, then 0.3, 0.5, 0.7, then 1, 1.5, 2, 2.5, 3 to 11 technically, and then there's an asterisk for absolute maximum. So very interesting to sort of break down the original information. And now you know, and so do I. So again, I'm sorry if this was a little bit all over the place. You're literally seeing real-time synthesizing of the information. I'm not done digging through this. I will be buying the 1998 Borg book because I feel like That's a must. And I'll probably go a little further on this at some point, but I wanted to at least introduce this idea, something that you've all probably been using for years. I highly recommend that you check your sources. And that was actually one thing that I said when I answered the original question. I was like, I definitely have a multiple versions or different versions of this. I have a 6 to 20, I have a 0 to 10, and I have a dyspnea scale. So I was correct 2 of the 3 scales, but it wasn't until I checked the original source that I truly got to the bottom of it. And so I just encourage that, right? If you receive a piece of information for someone or you're starting to use, new information, check your sources and see where that original data has come from. And I really honestly have to credit academia to this a little bit because one year I was teaching exercise science. And in my curriculum, I was doing submax and max testing and like field tests and submax tests with treadmill and bikes and all the things. So there were 2 bike tests, so YMCA and the Astrand rhyming cycle, I believe was the full name. And it wasn't in any textbook. The protocol did not exist. I spent literally days trying to find the protocol. And it wasn't until I got to the original article that Astrand wrote, and I think it was from like 1942 or 1960 something, that I learned the original friggin' protocol. Because every time it was spoken about in other texts, it was never the full protocol. It was spoken about, like the chart was there, but how you utilized it was not. And from a teaching perspective, I always want to know why, how, show me like the original, and then I can help digest that information. But if you're getting this like snippet of information and you don't really understand where it's coming from, you can't teach that, nor do you truly understand it. So if you're ever in that place where you're like, I wonder where this came from, or I wonder if there is verbiage attached to this, go back. Even if the article is from 1960 something, right? Technically, that's out of range of like appropriate research, but that's the original. And then typically what you find is a trail after that. So this original was literally modified over time, years of research, tweaking of verbiage to make sure it's the most accurate thing. So you want to make sure that whatever you're delivering is also accurate. And so that's where we're at. I have a Borg book that's on the list to purchase. I am officially licensed for educational purposes on RPE with Borg. And who knows, maybe we'll do a different podcast a little bit later, kind of diving into it a little bit deeper, maybe the history of it. Who knows? I have some ideas kind of a brewing, just a matter of getting it accomplished. So if you have any questions, reach out. And hopefully, if I don't know the answer, I will certainly do my due diligence to find it. All right. I hope you all have a wonderful day. I hope this was beneficial for you. If you utilize the RPE, check to see if you have a license for it. Get the original version, get the true instructions, and start utilizing it the way it was meant to be used. All right. If you have any questions, reach out. I hope you have a wonderful day. And whatever you have to do, get after it.